Look at any ancient temple, really look at it. Not as a tourist attraction or an archaeological curiosity, but as what it was designed to be: a house, a literal dwelling place for beings that most modern people assume were imaginary. Because according to the people who built these structures, the gods didn't visit occasionally, they lived there, full time, and they never moved out. The popular narrative about the Anunnaki goes something like this. Ancient gods descended from the heavens, ruled over humanity for a time, then departed back to wherever they came from, leaving us alone on this planet to figure things out for ourselves. It is a dramatic story. It implies a departure, an abandonment, a before and after. That is not what the Sumerian texts actually say. According to the people who worshipped them, the Anunnaki never left. They're still here. Or at least they were still here throughout the entire span of Mesopotamian civilization, from the first cities to the fall of Babylon. The gods didn't depart after the flood. They moved back in, and they stayed. If you are using this to fall asleep, perfect. This mystery has been hiding in plain sight for 4,000 years. Subscribe and stick around. To understand why the Anunnaki never left, you need to understand how the ancient Mesopotamians thought about divine presence. For them, the question wasn't whether the gods existed. That was obvious. The question was where exactly the gods chose to live, and the answer, according to every text we have, was remarkably specific. The gods lived in their temples, not metaphorically, not spiritually, physically. The Sumerian word for temple was Igal, which literally means great house. The Akkadian equivalent was Baitum, which simply means house or dwelling. These weren't places where humans went to worship absent deities. These were the actual residences of divine beings who happened to have human neighbors. At the center of every major temple was a cult statue. This wasn't a representation of the god, not in the way a photograph represents a person. The Mesopotamians believed that through a specific ritual called the Mispi, the washing of the mouth, and the Pitpi, the opening of the mouth, the statue became the god. Not symbolically, actually. The divine essence passed from the spiritual realm into the physical object. The mouth-washing ritual was elaborate and specific. It involved purifying the statue from any human contamination, since humans had physically made it. Then the mouth-opening ceremony enabled the statue to eat, drink, and speak. After these rituals were complete, the god was understood to have taken up residence. The statue's mouth was open because it needed to be fed, and fed it was every day. Multiple times a day, the temple staff prepared meals for their resident deity with the same care they would use for a living king. Breakfast in the morning to wake the god, lunch at midday, dinner in the evening. In later periods, some temples served 4 full meals daily, each with multiple courses. This wasn't symbolic offering. This was literally feeding the god. Priests would set the food before the statue on offering tables, then draw curtains so the god could eat in privacy. After a suitable interval, the curtains would be opened, and the food, now blessed by divine contact, would be distributed among the temple staff and sometimes to worshippers. The god had consumed the spiritual essence of the meal. The physical food remained for human use. But it wasn't just food. The gods needed to be clothed. Each deity owned multiple outfits, elaborate garments made from the finest materials available. Dressing ceremonies were performed regularly, with priests carefully changing the god's clothing according to season, festival, or the deity's known preferences. Some gods preferred certain colors, others had favorite jewelry. Priests awakened the statues in the morning with songs. They put them to bed at night. They bathed them, perfumed them, entertained them with music. The temple complex included not just the shrine where the statue resided, but kitchens, storerooms, workshops, and living quarters for the extensive staff required to maintain a divine household. Running a god's house was a full-time operation. The temple staff could number in the hundreds. Cooks and bakers to prepare meals, brewers to make the beer the gods loved, weavers to create divine garments, metal workers to craft jewelry and ritual objects, singers and musicians for divine entertainment, scribes to keep records of everything, administrators to coordinate the complex operations, and of course, the priests who performed the actual rituals. The high priest was one of the most powerful figures in any Sumerian city. In the earliest periods, before the rise of secular kingship, the high priest was often the de facto ruler. The En or Ensi, as they were called, served as the god's primary caretaker and representative. Their authority derived not from military power or hereditary right, but from their privileged access to the divine presence. Some high priestesses had even more direct divine roles. The En priestess of the moon god Nana at Ue was considered the god's earthly wife. She lived in a special residence called the Jippah, adjacent to the main temple, and her duties included ritual activities that maintained the fertility and prosperity associated with lunar cycles. The Nadatu priestesses formed another class of religious women. These were elite women, often daughters of prominent families, who dedicated themselves to temple service. They lived in cloistered communities called gagams, managing property, engaging in business transactions, but remaining celibate in service to their deity. Their presence represented humanity's ongoing commitment to divine care. Think about what this means. For over 3,000 years, from the earliest Sumerian cities through the fall of Babylon in 539 BCE, people dedicated their lives to caring for beings they believed were physically present in their temples. These weren't abstract theological exercises. These were daily routines. Wake up, feed the god, sing to the god, put the god to bed. The Sumerian king list, one of our oldest historical documents, makes a remarkable claim. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven. Not originated from heaven in the distant past, but came down, was actively lowered to earth after the great deluge had reset humanity. The gods didn't leave after the flood. They reasserted their presence. Kingship in Mesopotamia was understood as a divine institution. The king wasn't just a powerful human who happened to rule. He was the earthly representative of divine authority, chosen by the gods to execute their will among humans. The king's job was to maintain the connection between heaven and earth, to ensure that the gods remained satisfied with their earthly arrangements. And those arrangements were very specific. The primary duty of humanity, according to Mesopotamian theology, was to serve the gods. This wasn't just spiritual service. This was physical labor, agricultural production, craft work, all organized through temple complexes that functioned as the administrative and economic centers of Sumerian cities. The gods owned land, actual physical property. Temple estates could be enormous, covering thousands of acres, worked by laborers who understood themselves to be serving their divine landlord. The produce from these fields went directly to temple storehouses, used to feed the god, support the temple staff, and provide for the community in times of need. The economic power of the temples was immense. In some cities, the temple owned the majority of arable land. The god was, quite literally, the largest landowner in town. Farmers who worked temple lands paid rent in the form of labor or produce. Merchants who used temple storehouses paid fees. Everyone who dealt with temple resources was dealing with divine property. Scribes kept meticulous records of all temple transactions. We have clay tablets documenting how much grain was harvested from the god's fields, how many sheep were born in the god's flocks, how much beer was brewed in the god's brewery. These weren't metaphors. These were accounting documents for divine property, managed by human administrators. The temple also functioned as a bank. People could deposit valuables for safekeeping under divine protection. They could borrow against future harvests with the god as creditor. Temple loans financed trade expeditions and business ventures. Interest rates were set by religious authorities. The god was not only landlord but banker, investor, and economic regulator. In times of famine or disaster, the temple distributed stored grain to the population. The god cared for the people who served the god. This created a powerful social contract. Work the god's land, pay the god's dues, maintain the god's worship, and the god would ensure you didn't starve when the rains failed or the rivers flooded destructively. The relationship between city and patron deity was understood as mutual obligation. The god protected the city, ensured its prosperity, defended it from enemies. In return, the city's inhabitants cared for the god, maintained their temple, provided sacrifices and offerings. If either party failed in their obligations, the consequences could be catastrophic. Assyrian texts describe what happened when a city fell to invaders. The conquering army would seize the cult statue of the defeated city's patron deity. This wasn't just looting valuable property. This was understood as the god physically abandoning the city that had failed to protect their dwelling place. A city without its god was a city without divine protection. But this is exactly the point. The god didn't leave willingly. The god was taken. And even then, the Mesopotamians believed the god continued to exist, just in a new location. When Babylon's statue of Marduk was captured by enemies, the Babylonians didn't conclude that Marduk had ceased to exist. They concluded that Marduk was angry, that he had allowed himself to be taken as punishment for the city's failures. And when the statue was returned, as sometimes happened through treaty or reconquest, elaborate ceremonies welcomed the god home. The deity was understood to have been in exile, not to have disappeared. The physical presence of the god, embodied in the cult statue, was the continuous thread that connected divine and human worlds. Now, you might be thinking that all of this is just elaborate religious theater, that the priests knew they were feeding a statue, that the kings understood divine kingship was a useful political fiction. and maybe some of them did, but the textual evidence suggests that, for most people, most of the time, the divine presence in the temple was understood as literally real. Consider the votive statues. Throughout Mesopotamia, ordinary people would commission small statues of themselves in postures of worship. These statues would be placed in the temple, as close to the divine statue as access allowed. The idea was that even when the human worshipper couldn't be physically present, their statue would continue praying on their behalf. Thousands of these votive statues have been discovered by archaeologists. They range from simple figures to elaborate commissioned pieces showing wealthy patrons in their finest clothes. The eyes are often inlaid with shell and lapis lazuli, wide and staring, fixed eternally on the divine presence they were placed to worship. The votive statues were inscribed with the names of their donors, and often with prayers or dedications. The texts explicitly state the purpose: "Let this statue stand before the god and pray for me. Let it represent my devotion when I cannot be present myself." The statue was the worshipper's permanent ambassador to the divine realm. Think about what that implies. People believed that a statue could pray, that physical representation carried spiritual significance, that presence, even stone presence, mattered in the divine economy. If humans could be represented by statues that continued to function in their absence, why couldn't gods be present in statues that continued to live among humans? The temples weren't visited by gods from somewhere else. The temples were where the gods lived. Full stop. Enlil lived in his temple at Nippur. Enki lived in his temple at Eridu. Inanna lived in her temple at Uruk. Marduk lived in his temple at Babylon. These weren't vacation homes or temporary residences. These were the gods' permanent earthly addresses. Each major god had a primary residence, but might have secondary temples in other cities. Inanna had temples throughout Mesopotamia, but her primary home was the Enna temple in Uruk. Priests understood these relationships. When a god's secondary temple needed renovation, permission might be sought from the god's primary residence. The theology was explicit. Heaven existed. The gods had realms above the earth, but they also maintained physical presence among humans through their temple statues. They existed simultaneously in multiple places, their divine essence unlimited by physical constraints that bound mortal beings. A god could be in heaven and in their temple at the same time. This concept of simultaneous presence is difficult for modern minds trained in either, or thinking the god was fully in heaven. The god was also fully in the temple. These weren't partial presences or mere representations. The divine essence was genuinely present in both locations, unlimited by the spatial constraints that govern physical matter. Some texts describe the gods resting in heaven during certain periods, then descending to their earthly temples for festivals or important occasions. The ziggurat served as the landing pad, the point of arrival for divine beings commuting between cosmic realms. But even when a god was resting in heaven, their presence in the temple statue continued. The ziggurat, that distinctive stepped tower that defined Mesopotamian skylines, was understood as a physical link between earth and heaven. Not just symbolically, but functionally. The gods could descend the cosmic stairway to reach their earthly dwellings. The temple at the ziggurat's summit was literally a rest stop on the divine commute between realms. The construction of ziggurats was an act of cosmic architecture. Humans weren't just building tall structures, they were creating infrastructure for divine travel. The terraced levels represented the stages of ascent between earth and heaven. The summit shrine was positioned at the exact point where cosmic geography intersected with earthly space. Some ziggurats had names that made this connection explicit. The ziggurat at Babylon was called Anunnaki, which translates as House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. It wasn't just a tall building, it was the point where cosmic geography intersected with earthly geography, where the gods touched down when they descended to their terrestrial homes. The ziggurat at Ur, dedicated to the moon god Nana, was called Etamanigaru, meaning house whose foundation creates terror. The name emphasized the awesome power of the cosmic, earthly connection point. Approaching the ziggurat was approaching the junction of worlds. Ordinary humans could feel the divine presence radiating from its heights. But here is where it gets really interesting. The text describes specific moments when gods would be physically present in ways beyond their temple statues. During certain festivals, the statue would be removed from the temple and paraded through the city. The god was literally going for a walk, visiting other temples, blessing the streets and citizens. The Akitu festival at Babylon was perhaps the most elaborate of these events. Lasting 12 days at the new year, it involved Marduk's statue being taken from his temple, processed through the city, housed temporarily in a special Akitu house outside the city walls, then triumphantly returned. The entire population participated in welcoming their god back home. During the Akitu, the king played a crucial role. At one point, he was ritually humiliated before Marduk's statue, stripped of his regalia, slapped by the high priest, and forced to declare that he had not sinned against Babylon or neglected his duties to Marduk. Only after this ritual abasement was his kingship renewed for another year. The god could unmake kings as easily as make them. The gods had boats, full-sized barges stored in their temples, and used to transport their statues along the great rivers during religious festivals. They had chariots for land travel. Sometimes a god statue would be taken to the location of a battle, so the deity could watch the fighting unfold. The god wanted to be present for important events. Military campaigns were understood as divine affairs. The king went to war at the command of his god. Victory meant the god had supported the endeavor. Defeat meant the god was displeased or that enemy gods had prevailed. Bringing the god statue to the battlefield allowed the deity to directly observe and influence the outcome. The spoils of war included enemy gods. Capturing another city's cult statue was the ultimate victory. It meant not just conquering the humans, but subjugating their divine protector. Sometimes the captured statue was held hostage, only returned when favorable treaty terms were agreed. The god became a prisoner of war. Other gods might visit temple records describe occasions when the statue from one city would travel to another city's temple. Family reunions of sorts when divine siblings or parents and children would spend time together in one location. The logistics were complex. Multiple retinues of priests, elaborate preparations, diplomatic negotiations between cities. The sacred marriage ceremony took this even further. In this ritual, the king would ritually unite with the goddess Inanna, represented by either her statue or a high priestess serving as her vessel. The purpose was to ensure fertility and prosperity for the coming year. The goddess wasn't invoked from afar. She was present either in her statue or through her human representative. Some kings claimed even more direct divine connection. Naram, son of Akkad, was the first Mesopotamian king to be declared divine during his own lifetime. He wore the horned crown previously reserved for gods. His inscriptions used divine determinatives before his name. He wasn't just serving the gods. He was claiming to be one of them. Later kings followed this precedent. Shulgi of Ur-Hammurabi of Babylon, various Assyrian monarchs, all claimed divine status to varying degrees. The line between human and divine was understood as permeable. Humans could become gods. Gods could manifest through humans. The categories weren't as fixed as we might assume. This permeability extended to the dead as well. Deceased kings were understood to join the divine assembly, continuing to influence events from the underworld. Ancestors could be consulted through necromancy. The gods of the underworld, the Anunnaki in their role as judges of the dead, remained actively involved in human affairs even after life ended. The underworld wasn't hell in the Christian sense. It was simply where the dead went, a dark and dusty realm beneath the earth, where the spirits of the deceased continued to exist in diminished form. The dead required ongoing care from the living. Offerings of food and drink poured into the ground would reach them in the world below. Failure to care for the dead had consequences. Neglected spirits could return as malevolent ghosts, causing illness and misfortune among the living. The dead weren't gone. They were relocated to a different divine realm, still part of the cosmic system that included humans, gods, and everything in between. The descent of Inanna, one of the most famous Mesopotamian myths, describes the goddess's journey to the underworld and back. While there, she encounters the Anunnaki sitting as judges, determining the fates of the dead. The underworld wasn't a distant realm. It was directly beneath the earth, accessible through specific locations, staffed by divine beings. Ereshkigal, Inanna's sister, ruled the underworld as its queen. She had her own temple on the surface, where priests maintained her cult and made offerings to appease her. The underworld gods weren't enemies of the surface gods. They were part of the same divine family, ruling different territories within the cosmic order. So when we ask whether the Anunnaki ever left, we need to be specific about what we mean. Did they leave heaven? No, they still existed there. Did they leave the temples? Only when their statues were taken or destroyed. Did they leave the underworld? They continued to judge the dead for millennia. Did they stop intervening in human affairs? The entire structure of Mesopotamian society was built on the assumption that they were constantly intervening. The question might be better framed this way. Did the Anunnaki ever stop being relevant? And the answer for ancient Mesopotamians was absolutely not. From the moment after the flood, when kingship descended again from heaven, through the rise and fall of empires over 3,000 years, the gods remained central to everything. They owned the land. They received the sacrifices. They demanded the rituals. They determined fates. Consider the omen literature. Babylonian scribes compiled vast collections of signs and their meanings, observations of the natural world that revealed divine intentions, the movements of planets, the behavior of animals, the patterns of oil on water, the shapes of internal organs, even the birth of unusual creatures. All were messages from gods, who were constantly communicating with the humans, who knew how to read the signs. These weren't superstitions in the dismissive modern sense. They were systematic attempts to understand divine will, compiled over centuries into reference works that priests could consult. If a lamb is born with 2 heads, what does that mean? The Omen series had answers based on accumulated experience of what happened after previous 2-headed lambs. The gods were constantly speaking, constantly present, constantly involved in the smallest details of human life. Nothing happened without divine significance. Every unusual event was a message. Every decision could be guided by divine consultation. The gods hadn't gone anywhere. They were more present, more involved, more intimately connected to human affairs than most When Babylon fell to the Persians in 539 BCE, the Persian king Cyrus didn't destroy Marduk's temple. He presented himself as Marduk's chosen instrument, claiming that the god had selected him to restore proper worship after the previous Babylonian king had neglected divine duties. The conquest was framed not as the end of divine rule, but as divine intervention to change human management. The Cyrus cylinder, one of the most famous artifacts from ancient Persia, describes this theological transition explicitly. Marduk surveyed the lands looking for a righteous ruler. He pronounced the name of Cyrus. He made him march toward Babylon. Cyrus walked beside him like a friend. The god chose the conqueror. The conqueror served the god. This wasn't just propaganda, it was how ancient Near Eastern religions actually worked. Gods were tied to places, not to peoples. When a new empire conquered a region, the conquerors would typically adopt the local gods rather than trying to suppress them. The gods of Babylon became gods of the Persian Empire. Their temples continued to function. Even Alexander the Great, when he conquered Babylon, made a point of sacrificing to Marduk and ordering the restoration of temples that had fallen into disrepair. The gods were still there, still demanding service, still understood as the real owners of the land that human empires fought to control. Conquerors came and went. The gods remained. Alexander reportedly planned to make Babylon his eastern capital. He died there in 323 BCE, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, possibly in a room that looked out on the ziggurat of Marduk. The gods of Babylon had seen the rise and fall of Sumer, of Akkad, of Assyria, of Babylon itself. Now they watched as Greek conquerors walked their sacred streets. The Seleucid dynasty that followed Alexander continued the temple traditions. Greek administrators oversaw Babylonian priests performing rituals that had been conducted without interruption for 2,000 years. The god statues received their meals. The festivals continued. The divine presence persisted through yet another change of human management. The Parthians who followed the Seleucids showed similar respect. Then the Sasanians. Different empires, different languages, different human customs, but the same gods in the same temples, receiving the same care. The priests kept the traditions alive, passing knowledge from generation to generation, maintaining an unbroken chain of divine service. The end of active Mesopotamian religion came gradually, not through divine departure but through human conversion. As Christianity and Islam spread through the region, people stopped feeding the statues, stopped performing the rituals, stopped believing that divine beings physically inhabited temple buildings. The gods didn't leave. People stopped caring for them. The last cuneiform tablets we have come from the 1st century CE. By then, the old religion was dying. The temples were closing. The priests were aging out without successors. But for over 3,000 years before that, generations upon generations of humans had lived their entire lives in service to gods they believed were physically present in their communities. The astronomical tablets are among the last Babylonian priests continued recording celestial observations into the Common Era. Maintaining traditions of divine sky, watching that stretched back millennia. The stars were still divine signs. The movements of planets still revealed the gods' intentions, but fewer and fewer people cared to read them. Christianity offered something different. A God who had become human, lived among people, died, and risen. A God whose presence wasn't tied to a specific place or statue, but was available everywhere through faith. The temples of the old gods couldn't compete with churches that promised divine presence without the elaborate infrastructure of traditional worship. Islam came later with an even more radical proposition. No images of the divine at all. No statues that needed feeding, no temples that housed physical gods. Just submission to an invisible deity whose presence was everywhere and nowhere, requiring no special care, no daily meals, no elaborate rituals of clothing and bathing. The old temples fell into ruin. Sand and time buried the ziggurats. The cult statues were looted, destroyed, or simply abandoned. The clay tablets that recorded 3 millennia of religious practice were buried in collapsed buildings, waiting centuries for archaeologists to dig them out and puzzle over their strange claims. That is a staggering span of continuous divine presence. More than 3 millennia of daily rituals. More than 3,000 years of waking the gods, feeding the gods, clothing the gods, entertaining the gods. If the Anunnaki ever left, no Mesopotamian would have recognized that moment. From their perspective, the gods were always there. Modern scholars have various explanations for how this system actually worked. Some suggest the priests knew perfectly well they were feeding statues, but maintained the fiction for social control. Others propose genuine belief sustained by powerful psychological and social forces. A few argue for more exotic possibilities that we'll politely leave to one side. The cognitive science of religion offers some insights. Humans are naturally prone to seeing agency in the world, to attributing minds to things that move or seem to respond. A statue that receives offerings and seems to bring good fortune can feel genuinely responsive. The line between believing a statue contains a god and knowing it is just wood and metal may be blurrier than we assume. But whatever explanation you prefer, the textual evidence is clear. The Mesopotamians didn't believe the gods had left and might someday return. They believed the gods were right there in the temples that dominated every city skyline, receiving daily care from dedicated human servants who understood their purpose in cosmic terms. The idea of departed gods who might return is actually more characteristic of other religious traditions. The Aztec expectation of Quetzalcoatl's return, various cargo cult beliefs, certain messianic traditions, But Mesopotamian religion wasn't waiting for divine return because it never experienced divine departure. The gods were always home. Think about what this meant for everyday people. You weren't hoping the gods would notice you someday. You knew exactly where they lived. You could walk past their house on your way to the market. You could hear the hymns the priests sang to wake them in the morning. You could smell the incense that perfumed their chambers. The streets near the main temple were among the most desirable addresses in any Mesopotamian city. Living close to the god meant living close to power, to protection, to the source of cosmic order. The wealthy built their houses where they could watch the daily processions, hear the temple music, feel the presence of the divine neighbor who kept their city safe. If you had business with the gods, you knew where to go. If you wanted to present a petition, the procedures were established. If you needed divine blessing for a journey, a business venture, a marriage, there were rituals for that. The gods were accessible, approachable, literally within walking distance. The temples maintained records of divine responses. When someone asked the gods a question through divination, examining the entrails of sacrificed animals or the patterns of oil on water, the results were recorded over centuries. These records accumulated into reference libraries that priests could consult. What did the gods say last time someone asked this question? Dreams were another avenue of divine communication. People would sleep in temples, hoping to receive messages from the gods during the night. These dreams were recorded, interpreted, and added to the accumulated knowledge of divine preferences and intentions. The gods spoke to those who knew how to listen. This is perhaps the strangest aspect of Mesopotamian religion for modern people to grasp. We tend to think of gods as either absent, present only through faith, or potentially present in mystical experiences. The Mesopotamians thought of gods as physically present in specific buildings, requiring specific care, with knowable preferences and predictable routines. Enlil liked things quiet. That is why the noise of humanity disturbed him. Inanna was passionate and demanding. Enki was clever and scheming. These weren't abstract theological principles. These were the personalities of beings who lived down the street and had to be managed accordingly. You learned their preferences, the way you learned a difficult neighbors. Some gods were easier to deal with than others. Enki was known for being helpful to humans, willing to share knowledge and intervene on humanity's behalf. Enlil was more demanding, more likely to punish than to forgive. Inanna was unpredictable, capable of great generosity and terrible violence, knowing which god to approach for which problem was practical knowledge. The Anunnaki, in their role as collective pantheon, were understood as a kind of divine assembly, meeting to make decisions that affected both heaven and earth. They voted on fates. They debated policies. They sometimes disagreed with each other. The assembly of the gods was the cosmic equivalent of a city council, handling the business of running the universe. When the gods decided something, it was binding. The Mes, those fundamental decrees that governed civilization, agriculture, kingship, crafts, were divine decisions that humans could not overturn. The flood itself was an assembly decision. So was humanity's creation. So were the rules that structured every aspect of Mesopotamia. The myth of Inanna and Enki describes how the goddess traveled to Eridu and obtained the Mes from Enki bringing civilization's fundamental powers to her city of Uruk. The Mies included everything from kingship and priesthood to music and metalworking. They weren't just abstract concepts, they were real powers that could be transferred, stolen, or lost. This meant that divine presence wasn't just about individual gods in individual temples. The entire structure of civilization was divine. The ability to plant crops, to work metal, to write, to govern. All of these were gifts from gods who remained present to ensure their gifts were properly used. Pull out the divine foundation and civilization itself would collapse. The laws were divine. Hammurabi's famous code wasn't presented as human legislation. The stele shows Hammurabi receiving the laws directly from Shamash, the sun god of justice. The king wasn't creating law, he was transmitting divine decree. Every judgment based on that code was ultimately a divine judgment. The gods speaking through human intermediaries. This is why the temples were so central to Mesopotamian cities. They weren't just religious buildings, they were the source of everything. Law came from the gods. Economic organization came from the gods. Agricultural knowledge came from the gods. Writing itself was a divine gift. Without the gods' ongoing presence, none of these things would function properly. So here is the answer to why the Anunnaki never actually left. According to Sumerian records, they never intended to leave. They established cities for themselves on Earth. They built temples as their permanent residences. They created humans specifically to serve them in those residences, and they maintained that arrangement for as long as humans would cooperate. The flood wasn't about leaving. It was about control. When humanity became too numerous and too noisy, the gods pruned the population. Then they re-established the arrangement with better controls, including human mortality and limited fertility. The gods stayed. Humans were the ones who were adjusted. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven. New cities were built, new temples were constructed. The gods took up residence again. Everything continued as before, just with a chastened humanity that better understood its place in the cosmic hierarchy. Serve the gods. Feed the gods, don't make too much noise. Remember what happened last time. The Sumerian king list records this transition matter of factly. Before the flood, kingship was in these cities for these spans of time. Then the flood swept over. Then kingship descended from heaven again. The list continues through historically verifiable rulers, treating mythical and historical kings as equally real, divine arrangement and human governance as seamlessly continuous. That continuity is the key point. The gods didn't appear, rule for a while, then withdraw. They appeared, established civilization, created humans to maintain it, and stayed to receive the service that was their due. The arrangement was permanent. The commitment was open-ended. The gods were landlords who never intended to sell the property. Only when humans stopped believing did the arrangement end. Not because the gods left, but because the humans did. Convert to Christianity, convert to Islam. Stop feeding the statues, let the temples crumble. Move on to new gods who make different demands. The Anunnaki didn't leave, they were abandoned. From a Mesopotamian perspective, this would have been the ultimate tragedy. The gods who had created humanity, who had taught them civilization, who had protected their cities for millennia, finally abandoned in turn, not because the gods chose to depart, but because their human servants found other masters, other beliefs, other houses to build. If you are drifting off now, consider this final thought. For over 3,000 years, people believed they shared their cities with divine beings. They woke those beings each morning and put them to bed each night. They fed them and clothed them and entertained them. They arranged their entire civilization around serving them. Were they wrong? We can't really know. We can know that they believed it completely, that they organized their lives around it entirely, that they maintained the rituals for longer than most civilizations exist, that from their perspective, the question of whether the gods left would have been incomprehensible. The gods were right there. How could they leave? The temples still stand. Some of them, crumbled and empty now. Their statues long since stolen or destroyed. But in the imagination of ancient Mesopotamia, they were never empty. They were always occupied. The gods were always home. The Anunnaki never left, because leaving was never the arrangement. They came to stay. When modern visitors walk through the ruins of Ur or Babylon or Nippur, they're walking through what were once divine neighborhoods. Holy ground, not because something sacred happened there once, but because for 3,000 years, divine beings were understood to physically inhabit those spaces every day. Without interruption, that is what the Sumerian records actually reveal about the Anunnaki. Not that they arrived mysteriously and departed mysteriously, but that they arrived, established permanent residence, and stayed until the humans who served them stopped believing. The gods didn't leave humanity. Humanity left the gods, and the temples have been empty ever since. Thanks for spending this time exploring the strange persistence of divine presence in ancient Mesopotamia. The temples have been waiting for visitors for thousands of years. They can wait a few more hours while you rest. Subscribe and stick around. There is always another mystery waiting in the clay. Sleep well. And remember, according to the people who knew them best, the Anunnaki were never distant beings who visited occasionally. They were neighbors, landlords, permanent residents of the cities they created. They lived in their temples for over 3,000 years. They never left. They were simply eventually forgotten.